Let's welcome Stephen Brown, again, our KPMG Leadership Center, Board Leadership Center co-facilitator, who will introduce the next panel.
Well, thank you. Good afternoon. We have two more panels to go. Thank you. Thank you. Good afternoon. Oh, thank you. That was just for me, for my ego at 2:50 in the afternoon on a Friday. We had some great panels and great speakers, but we've saved the best for last, the next two panels. I thank the Honorable Scott Stringer for his words, and he's exactly right when it comes to having the will. And this panel, we have some great luminaries, and he's absolutely right about Mike. Mike will not be lost for words because he's one of the most important thought leaders in corporate governance in the United States, and he will not be lost for words, even if Scott took a few of them. And the interesting thing is that we have 50 states in our union, 50 state pension plans and treasurers. We can count on barely two hands, maybe 1.5 hands, how many of those states actually, in their pension plans, are actually active in the governance conversation, and that's really sad. A few years ago, actually, probably about 10 years ago, when I was at TIA-CREF, I was asked after a conference like this, where the chairperson of a state pension fund, a fund that was in a western state, not Idaho, said, would you come and talk to my board about governance, because I think we need to do more governance. And I said, sure. So I went out there and did a presentation, and afterwards they all said, all the board members, we're not New York, we're not Washington. We don't think that our constituents will go for this liberalness of taking these actions on corporate governance. So thank you for coming, though, but we're not interested. And again, I was invited by their chairman, but they collectively didn't have the will. The folks that we have here today have the will, and you'll be listening to them. They'll be led by our moderator, who is Charlotte Laurent Ottoman. Ottoman, I screwed it up after practicing that. I apologize. She's the co-founder and executive director of the 30% Coalition, whose membership includes investment in pension funds representing more than 3.2 trillion with a T assets under management. They are focused on increasing gender, race, and ethnic diversity on corporate boards. Her past has been leading investor relations and capital market strategy at Alcatel-Lucent, a Global 2000 company. Charlotte, if you will join me on the stage, if we can give her a hand, as I introduce your panelists. So I said you can count on just barely 1.5 hands how many states have a deep interest in corporate governance, and we have a number of them here today. First up is Travis. I practiced his name, and I just balked. I'm sorry. Travis Antoninoio.
A few extra syllables.
Yes, who's the investment officer in corporate governance of the California State Teachers Plan. Another great friend who is now a New Yorker. And you can tell by her Brooklyn accent when she comes up. The managing director of BlackRock, head of corporate governance and responsible investment team, Michelle Edkins. And from the great state of Illinois, Rodrigo Garcia, who's the chief investment officer and chief financial officer of the Illinois State Treasury. The aforementioned Michael Garland, Assistant Controller, Corporate Governance and Responsible Investment for the City of New York. And last but not least is Jarrett Landau, Partner, Chief Operating Officer and General Counsel of Barrington Capital Group, who I'm so happy to have here, and is a rarity here, in that he's a hedge fund. And you often don't have those types of folks in conversations like this. So we're happy to have this august panel. I'll give it to you, Charlotte.
Thank you for staying after lunch with us. I'd like to start off by, before we introduce the panel further, if I may, just to put this in context a bit of what what we're doing at the 30% Coalition. This is an organization that was founded 6 years ago with the idea that, yes, the supply side is fine. We have plenty of qualified candidates. The challenge is that there are not really many board seats for them. So we founded the Coalition, which is a coalition of organizations. We have 100 members with the mission of creating demand. And we've been pretty successful in doing that. Within our membership, we have a group of corporate leaders. We have a group of government officials, of which Scott Stringer, Mike Garland are part of our group, along with the Illinois State Treasurer and many others. We have also a large group of advocacy and nonprofit organizations, of which we're proud and honored to have LCDA a part of us, Ascend Pinnacle, who you heard from earlier today, and most of the major women's organizations and advocacy organizations in the United States. 35 to 40% of our membership are institutional investors. And we've touched on this. I spoke with some of you yesterday at the BRI sessions. We touched on the institutional investor impact throughout the day. And I sat in my chair on my hands, trying not to wave, because we do have a very significant investor initiative going on here in the United States. We got lucky at the Coalition. We had a lot of founding members who were institutional investors. We have grown that over the years. And as Stephen mentioned, today, assets under management are $3.2 trillion. Close to half of that is coming from Japan. We have the Government Pension Fund of Japan as a member of the 30% Coalition, which is huge when you know the culture and the investment environment in Japan. We have spent a lot of energy on a very directed strategy, and some of the panelists will talk more about that today because they are also doing this on an individual basis. But we have an Adopt a Company campaign in which our investors reach out to those companies with 0 women. And while our mission is a corporate boardroom that reflects the ethnic, racial, and gender diversity of the U.S. workforce, the 30% Coalition traditionally has been focused on women, particularly women of color, in terms of our ask and in terms of our tracking. I've spoken with a lot of you. I'm hoping that will change, but I don't want to go off track today. As a result of our letter writing campaign, engagement with shareholders, which has been extremely collaborative, even though we're called the 30% Coalition, we're not talking about quotas, we're talking about an objective. We now have more than 150 companies who have appointed a woman to the board for the first time, and in many instances, a woman of color. And notice, thank you. Notice I say companies, my emphasis on companies and the demand that we've created, not the 150 women, which is important as well. And one of our goals is to work with organizations such as LCDA, Ascend, and the rest of them to try to match that demand and supply. So today we have a panel that is really interesting because we're all working toward the same goal of increasing diversity in the corporate boardroom. But my panelists are all doing it with a little bit different twist. So I think it's going to be really interesting to hear their story and understand how they're going after the mission. So I'd like to start off by just asking each one of them to, again, I know Stephen introduced them, but to introduce themselves and talk just a little bit about your organization and, in general, briefly, the work you're doing in the diversity space. Travis?
Yeah, Travis Antoniono, investment officer. I work at CalSTRS. CalSTRS is located in West Sacramento. We represent the retired and current teachers in California, a little over 900,000 now. CalSTRS as an organization has about $220 billion of assets under management. And the asset class that I work in is called corporate governance. Corporate governance is a little bit different from some of the other corporate governance asset classes across the pension systems in America, in that not only do we lead the proxy voting, engagement, and regulatory outreach efforts, but we also manage a activist and sustainability public equity portfolio as well. My efforts are to co-manage a sustainability portfolio within the corporate governance unit, and then also lead the environmental engagements with our companies. But previously, about 3 or 4 years ago, I was leading a lot of the efforts with diversity. It's since passed on to Mary Morris, who's a member of 30% Coalition.
CalSTRS is a member.
CalSTRS has been a member.
Founding member.
Exactly. Yeah, very happy to, and been a great relationship and collaboration with not only yourself, but the whole group and all the institutions that have came on board over the last several years. That's a little bit about myself. You'd like to a little detail as well,
We'll
or
go back.
go back? Sure.
Let Michelle.
Sure. I'm Michelle Adkins. I'm working at BlackRock on our corporate governance and engagement team. We have a team of about 30 people based around the world who talk to the public companies that we invest in on behalf of our clients about the quality of board leadership and the quality of management. Because basically to us, that's what corporate governance is about. It isn't a checklist of various characteristics. It is tell us why this company is well led and well managed, and therefore likely to generate the returns our clients depend on over time. We have been looking at diversity for quite a few years and have predominantly been doing that through engagement with companies. So talking to them about how they think about it and what they are doing to increase the diverse directors on their boards and to establish employment practices within the company that builds a diverse pipeline of employees so that there's a leadership path for people who are not of the dominant culture in their company. We're not looking at diversity from a social justice perspective. That is an important component of it, but it's not a driver for us because the mandate we get from our clients is not about social justice. It's about generating returns for them. So we look at diversity because the board is fundamentally a decision-taking body. And there is a lot of research that points to the fact that diverse groups, whether it's in a boardroom or somewhere else, take better decisions. It's generally harder for them to get to the decision because there are so many different perspectives weighing in, and sometimes building a consensus takes a bit longer. But the decision, the outcome is generally more resilient and better over time in terms of the outcomes. There's another reason we look at diversity, and that is because the workforce is now more diverse than it's ever been. And if companies truly are going to win the war for talent that they all say they're in, they need to demonstrate to the people they're bringing in out of school that those people, the talented people who work hard and take opportunities in the company, are trained and developed and stay, have a career path, even if they're not of the dominant culture. And the implicit signal that comes from having diverse leadership is there is that path. And that's hugely important if you're going to keep talented people and encourage them to engage and aspire for great things in the company. So it all comes down to performance, basically. Now, a lot of people talk about diversity of mindset, and in so many ways, as we all know, because we've been engaging on this for a long time, that can often be an excuse for saying we don't want people who look different to us because we all think differently, because we went to different schools or we grew up in different cities or whatever. There is also research, predominantly out of University of Texas, that shows that visible diversity is hugely important to demonstrating that quality of decision making. And that's because when people look different to you, you don't assume you think the same way. And this is a very ancient human instinct, and it really does drive behavior and drives people to prepare better for their board meetings and drives them to discuss in a more engaged way the things that are being discussed in the board. So I'll leave it there.
Okay, thank you. Rodrigo?
Excellent. I thought that was a great introduction into why we care about board diversity. Now, I've been in my role for about 3 years, And upon doing a management shakeup and kind of getting the people in place that we wanted to do and getting the investment strategies in place, one of the areas that I knew that I wanted to get into was corporate governance, because I understand the fundamental value that corporate governance brings to the long-term enterprise value in the companies that we own. And so one of the first key steps that we wanted to do is we went out and started talking to our managers. We have funds with BlackRock, we have funds with Vanguard, we have funds with State Street, but we also have funds with tons of other fund managers. And we started asking those questions. How do you vote your proxies? What do you look into? What are the issues that you tend to do research on? Do you just default to ISS and Glass Lewis? Do you provide them any guidance? What are some of the guidelines that you provide? And so that was one area that, and I can get into, because we started seeing some progress as people started realizing, hey, in a world where asset management is becoming increasingly competitive with the advance of robo-advisors or indexing, or even just in terms of fees, we started seeing that they wanted to differentiate themselves, and we started seeing that they have begun to address proxy voting, address corporate governance, whether it's accountability, transparency, as well as engagement with many corporate boards. And then the second one is the more direct one, the one that has been alluded to here before. Now we do direct engagements with some of the companies that we own, but we also don't do it in isolation. We have, whether it's through the 30% Coalition or, for example, the Midwest Diversity Coalition, where we pair up with other institutional investors around the Midwest. And then we used the collective assets that we have to go and talk to companies, because we don't want to go and issue shareholder resolutions. We want to work proactively with those companies to see what we can do to help them move the ball forward. And we understand that this is a process. And so thus far, we've definitely had many companies have changed not only their board recruitment policies, but also have brought on diverse candidates. And for us, it is a progress, and one that we will continue to fight on both fronts, because we know that we can't do it just on the second front. We need the BlackRocks and the Vanguard and the State Streets to come up and also make this battle their own.
Mike?
Great. Thank you, Charlotte. So I'm Mike Garland, and what he said. I work for Controller Stringer. I oversee the governance program, so our team is responsible for implementing the program that he's put in place with respect to the Boardroom Accountability Project. I don't want to be too redundant, just hit a few quick points. The Controller is the investment advisor for and a trustee of the city's 5 pension systems. So collectively, it's about $190 billion in assets. We have about 10,500 companies around the world, including nearly 3,500 public companies here in the U.S. The city has a very long history of engaging our portfolio companies on a broad range of environmental, social, and governance issues, including through shareholder proposals. And we've probably filed more, I shouldn't say probably, we have certainly filed more shareholder proposals than any institutional investor in the world, and we've been doing it for about 30 years. For those of you who are on boards or with companies, we don't view a shareholder proposal as an escalation tactic. It's an invitation to engage. We would like to withdraw that proposal, and these days, more often than not, we do. We just find it an efficient mechanism. And in a minute, when I get a chance to talk a little bit more and go in a little more detail, and hopefully not be too redundant about the Boardroom Accountability Project, that was really an effort to take the conviction that the controller and our trustees had about the need to move more aggressively on promoting diversity in a way that took advantage of our sort of comparative advantage in terms of our ability to file shareholder proposals. So the whole project was launched through a sort of shock and awe shareholder proposal strategy, which I can talk about in a minute. But the project's been very successful. I think we'll come around to it, so I don't want to get into it now. But I'll leave you with 2 numbers that hopefully I'll then elaborate on in terms of the state of play for diversity. 50% and 1%. Mm-hmm. And depending on how you look at it, this is a glass half full or a glass half empty. although it's actually not out yet, the Wall Street Journal just reported on a Spencer Stewart study that just came out. 50% of the most recent incoming class of directors were women and/or minorities, which is pretty good.
Fantastic.
The percentage of the female representation on boards crept up 1%, from 21 to 22%. Glacial. And that's been happening year in and year out. I think the 50% is a little higher than it's been, so that's good news. But women certainly have made up roughly a third of the incoming class for the past several years, and it barely moves the needle. And so this really speaks to board refreshment challenges. I think boards, mainly responding to investor pressure, take seriously the issue of diversity, but there's no urgency. And I think the core of the problem is directors don't like to tell other directors when it's time to go. So that's really the basis on which we launched a project to try and create some urgency in the boardroom.
Jared?
Thank you, Charlotte. My name's Jared Landau. I'm Chief Operating Officer of Barrington Capital Group, and it's a real pleasure to be here today. While the comments I make are my own, let me tell you a little bit about Barrington Capital Group and why we care so much about board diversity. Barrington is a value-focused activist hedge fund that was founded by James Materatunda in January 2000. We seek to invest in undervalued, publicly traded companies where we can help facilitate companies taking action to unlock their value potential. We work with industry experts to develop plans to help a company improve long-term value, and then we seek to collaborate with these companies over a multi-year period to implement our ideas, where long-term investors, our typical investment time frame is 3 years. Many people refer to us as operational activists because of the nature of our plans, but in many ways, corporate governance is equally important in our investment approach. Capital Finance International, we were honored to be named by them as having the best activist investor corporate governance team in 2016 because they noted we were one of the first activist hedge funds to note the correlation between poor corporate governance and underperformance at companies. And while that must be obvious to all of us in this room, it was actually a big deal for an activist to recognize that in January 2000. So when we look at companies to invest in, we often find that they've underperformed their peers and the market as a whole for a substantial period of time, often 10 to 15-year periods. And you have to ask yourself, why hasn't the board on its own self-corrected? Why haven't they added a new director with expertise where the company is challenged? Why haven't they brought in a new CEO? Why haven't they engaged a consulting firm to take a look at some of these problems? And what we find is that at these companies, there's inevitably corporate governance weaknesses. And in our opinion, the largest governance weakness is a homogeneous board that lacks the diversity of directors with relevant skills, experiences, and perspectives to keep the company competitive in today's challenging global markets. So just take a look at the statistics. I mean, in our view, diversity is absolutely in need of improvement. As was mentioned, women right now only constitute 21% of the directors at S&P 500 companies. And while gender diversity has received a lot of attention, less attention, I believe, is being paid to the fact that racial and ethnic diversity is also extremely poor. Minorities make up only 14% of directors on S&P 500 companies. But when you take a look at the smaller companies, and Barrington, we focus on small and mid-cap companies, the numbers are really quite atrocious. Minorities only make up 9% of the directors at mid-cap companies and only 7% of the directors at small-cap companies. So with all the great investor pressure that is being put on companies, particularly the largest companies, by some of my colleagues here on this panel, you start to see some improvement. And so, for instance, minority representation on boards is the highest at the top 200 companies at 15%. But that level has stayed the same for 5 years. Only, by the way, 4.8% of directors at these 200 largest companies are Latino, despite the fact that, as we know, Latinos comprise approximately 18% of the U.S. population. So why are these statistics important to an activist hedge fund? Well, director likeness can lead to clubby boards. It can lead to groupthink that can diminish board effectiveness. And what we find is that when you have a clubby board, there's often significant relationships. Remember, and we're looking at underperforming companies. So when you look at clubby boards of underperforming publicly traded companies that have underperformed for a substantial time period, that's the audience that we look at. We find there's often relationships between the directors and the CEOs and between the directors and themselves. So what we have found is that when you can inject into these homogeneous boards, when you can improve board diversity, suddenly the new directors come in and they're less concerned about the relationships amongst their colleagues and the relationship with the CEO and more concerned with the job at hand. We find that diversity ultimately improves board independence. As Michelle said, it improves debate and discussion. The new directors come in asking tough questions and are not afraid to challenge management if it's appropriate. And in addition, it improves the knowledge base on the board, bringing in new perspectives, new expertise, and ultimately this leads to improved decision-making and board oversight.
Thank you. One of the things, when we started the coalition back in the 2011, one of the commitments we made was that we would do something. I think the statistics that Jared and the rest of the panelists have talked about are atrocious. But I think the next question is, so what are we going to do about it? And, Mike, you made an interesting statement that we see a shareholder resolution as, what'd you say? Not threatening, as an engagement or something like that. Maybe, and I'll start with you because I think you and the controller have been extremely active with your proxy access, with your latest board accountability. What are you doing and what are your results? I know that you've gotten some really positive results from this last outreach with your board accountability. So maybe you could talk about that.
Sure, thanks, Charlotte. And to put the project in context, and as the controller described, 4 years ago, in looking for a way to increase the accountability, responsiveness, diversity of our portfolio company boards, we came up with a strategy around proxy access, which is the right for shareholders to nominate directors using the company ballot. It's a right that the SEC first proposed that shareholders have at all public companies following the collapse of Enron. The U.S. Chamber of Commerce threatened to sue the SEC. Nothing ever happened. Then following the financial crisis, Mary Shapiro proposed a rule at the SEC. Congress put a provision in the Dodd-Frank Act that affirmed the SEC had the authority to enact its rule, to inoculate the SEC from litigation. And then the SEC enacted the rule, and a month later, the Chamber of Commerce sued anyway. And so for 1 month, shareholders had the right at all U.S. public companies, if you held 3% for 3 years, to nominate up to a quarter of the board. We lost that right, but we retained the right to ask for the right, and companies were obviously very resistant to proxy access because it changes the power relationships in the boardroom. So after several years of virtually no progress, as Controller Stringer mentioned, there were 6 companies in the U.S. In the fall of 2014 that provided this right. We filed, in a matter of 2 weeks, 75 shareholder proposals asking for proxy access at companies. Diversity was an umbrella, but it was really companies that either lacked diversity in their boardroom, had a history of excessive CEO pay, or carbon-intensive energy companies with significant exposure to climate risk. And we had big dust up at the time, but ultimately we've changed the playing field, and today 450 companies in the US have proxy access. Not easy to use. The expectation isn't that it's going to be used frequently, but the expectation is the specter of a proxy access nominee will make boards more responsive to share owner concerns on anything from policies and practices to the composition of the board itself. And when it comes to diversity, that, a key priority of the funds, the sort of rhetorical line is, either you fix this problem quickly or we will do it for you. And now that we've crossed over 60% of the S&P 500, and to make sure we have a uniform proxy access rights across the market, we've actually focused on some fairly small companies down to less than $1 billion in market cap. We just last month launched round 2 of our project, where about a third of the 450 US companies that have proxy access enacted it directly in response to our shareholder proposal. I think all of the companies have it sort of as a result of the broader initiative. So we sent a letter to 150 companies to test the notion about responsiveness to shareholders. And as the controller mentioned, the letter went to the chair of the nominating committee, and we said, we want to talk to you about your board composition, diversity, and refreshment. We want to understand how you get rid of directors who are no longer appropriate for the board. What's the board's refreshment process? How do you work with search firms? How do you identify diverse candidates? And as a predicate to the discussion, we want you to provide to us and to disclose to all shareholders the skills and experience matrix that the controller mentioned. And the board should define the dimensions of the matrix that it believes highlight the most important skills, experience, backgrounds relevant to this board, whether it's international expertise, marketing, and the 2 or 3 things that each director brings to the table that are relatively unique, but so we can get a picture of the board as a whole. But some of the dimensions of the matrix should be mandatory across companies, and that's the gender of the directors and the race and ethnicity. And we sent the letter in early September to 150 companies, and we've already heard preliminarily and had conversations, at least with management as an initial step. We've received some form of response from over 100 companies, which we sometimes send letters and never hear. There was a little self-selection here. We'd talked to most of these companies over the past several years, but we are deep in a process of deep engagement with a large number of companies, well beyond negotiating the terms of a particular bylaw or investor right. And we'll see come proxy season where we move the ball on disclosure and hopefully also have, we're asking companies to create a more formal process for shareholder input on nominees. I think Charlotte's right. There's the demand issue, but the biggest issue is the vacancy and refreshment. We can, if directors hang out until they retire or hit term limits, it's going to be a long process, and we're going to have a lot of long tenured old directors in the boardroom.
Thank you. And maybe the Rodrigo, Michelle, and Travis talk a little bit about what you all are actually doing to make a difference with the companies. Want to go first?
Yeah, really I think the question at hand really is focused on a couple of words: board composition. That's what it's all about. And the mission is to be able to empower the board, enforce or incentivize change to occur. How do you do that? That's the big question. How do you make this change occur? And we see it at CalSTRS as basically 3 different functions that can drive this change. 1, regulatory reform. 2, voting your proxy. And 3, corporate engagement. 3 simple things, but the execution of these things can be quite in-depth and very challenging, and could take several years before a significant accomplishment is actually occurring. But around these changes, I'll dive in just to a quick couple of examples. 1, around regulatory reform, we reach out to the SEC. We write letters to the SEC. We look at what human capital management is, and we also look at what skills matrices are. And there's others in this room that have also written to the SEC on these similar efforts to be able to say that this matters to us, this disclosure matters to us, And we want to see companies reporting on this. Instead of us going and writing 1,000 different companies and having, and I applaud the efforts that New York is doing. But it would be so much easier if it was just regulated. It would save us a lot of time.
Modeled it on the petition, very, very much so.
Yeah.
Breaking news is that Mary Jo White encouraged us to go see Chair Clayton. So I've already put together a little coalition, which obviously includes you, to do just that, and LCDA. I mean, we're going to, I think, really push for some, because the SEC up until now has been, I think, very weak on this issue. And they've not enforced whatever they've come up with. Sorry to interrupt.
No, yeah. And this is, so that really covers the regulation part. Outside of regulation, which it could be deemed as one of the most difficult to overcome or to enact some type of change, you have proxy voting and corporate engagement. On proxy voting, CalSTRS, we just passed a policy just 2 days ago that allows us to vote against certain key management that has not done any change or made any progress around board diversity. The extent that we'll actually be utilizing this is somewhat low initially, but it could garner and gain some traction over time. What we're going to be focusing on is those companies that we've had significant engagement efforts with, or at least outreach to, over the last several years, and yet the companies have not taken any action. Time and time again, after we've engaged a company, no action has occurred. That's when we'll decide whether or not to withhold from the governance and nominating committee. And if that doesn't wake the company up a little bit, then in years forward, we might actually vote and withhold votes from the entire board. Outside of proxy voting, though, we have company engagement. And this is really touching to the points that my other panelists have also brought up as well. Everything, you're looking for what mechanisms do you have to enact change? Tenure, age, refreshment. What type of things do they have in their charter that they're currently not even abiding to? These are things that they place themselves in the charter. If they have an age limit, but that's, let's say, 70 years old, and yet they have a 73-year-old on the board, is there a reason for that? If they have someone that's on the board for the last 30 years, and they're classifying that person as independent, is that person really independent? Why is that person still on the board, and what type of value is that person actually providing to the board? These are questions that we bring up to companies when we meet with them every single year, and for a lot of companies, it's multiple times a year. But it's these type of questions that should be brought forth to the company, and the company should be providing answers to and justifying on why there isn't additional turnover occurring. So as someone else already mentioned, 50% diverse members this last year, move the needle 1%. You're not going to be seeing 100% allocation during any given year. So unless there's additional turnover occurring, you're only going to see that glacial movement occur. What we need to see is higher turnover.
And one of the things, Michelle, before I turn to you, one of the things that we're doing at the coalition is that CalSTRS and the New York State Controller, New York City Controller, along with a couple of mutual funds, may co-file together or co-engage together. So rather than, I have 200,000 shares, we now have, as a group, 5 to 10% of your capital.
Thanks for bringing that up.
And that makes it a much more significant conversation. You obviously already have that, Michelle. BlackRock has what is your AUM?
It's just shy of $6 trillion.
Okay, so she doesn't really need to do that. But anyway, what are you all doing?
So I agree absolutely with what Mike and Travis have just said, but the thing I want to add is the turnover won't change anything if the appointment process doesn't change. Now, a well-known fact is that 80% of board roles are filled through the incumbent board members' networks. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. Boards are a human group, they do human things. Most of us will bring into our group someone we can vouch for. They don't have to be close friends, but we can vouch for them. And bringing in outsiders, bringing in new people to a board is seen for a director as a high-risk thing. That's why they're not very radical about bringing in people who are different for whatever reason. And I think as diverse candidates who want to get on boards, you need to think really carefully about who you are networking with. Because if you're only networking with people who are not on nominating and governance committees, you're not going to get on a board.
Find some new friends.
And it is, you know, one of the questions that we ask boards when we do an engagement around the, you know, increasing the diversity on the board is how do the directors build their networks to ensure that they are aware of the diverse talent that is available. Because as so many people in the room will know, one of the excuses for not having a diverse board is the talent isn't out there. Now, we all know that is very lame and it's not actually true, but if you only network with people like you, that is why you think they're not there. One of the other things that we encourage boards to do when they are saying, we're really struggling with this, it's so hard, you don't appreciate how hard it is, we encourage them to look at the platforms that I believe you've heard from over the course of your conference, from Equila, from Boardspan, from New Role, which is a UK-based online platform for self-nomination and enhancing or increasing the pool of diverse candidates and first-time directors. The other thing I think is really interesting about the study that Mike mentioned is that 45% of the directors appointed in this particular year, the sort of roughly 400 directors, 45% of them have never served on a public company board before. And that's another change that will have to take place more widely if we're going to get more diverse candidates on boards. Everyone has to serve on their first board at some stage, but it's again used as an excuse for not bringing on diverse candidates. Oh, they don't know about board service. And again, it's a fallacy because a lot of people who have a diverse profile have served on really impactful boards. They just don't happen to be public company boards. So really, in our engagements, we're saying you need to be deliberate about this, and we need to see that you are being deliberate about it. And we're about to write to the 200 or so companies in the Russell 1000 that have fewer than 2 women directors to say you need to put out a detailed plan for how you're going to increase the diversity on your board, and you need to do something about that. So the detailed plan has to be out in your next proxy, so by next shareholder meeting season, and we need to see progress on that within the next 2 shareholder meetings, because we do understand it can take time. And finding any director can take time. And we have said very clearly, if you don't do this, we as a 6, 7, 8% shareholder in your company will be voting against the Nominating Governance Committee chair and possibly the whole committee. Now, directors don't like it when they get less than about 97% support for their re-election, and we are hoping that this will get their attention because the excuses are really tired now.
Thank you. And before I turn to you, Rodrigo, what I'd like to also clarify is that when our investors make the ask, they're not just saying, you know, put a woman or a minority on the board. I mean, that's too easy. It's like, well, okay, how about you? Why don't you go in the boardroom? First of all, there's got to be a pipeline in the company. It has to be thoughtful. But what they're asking is for disclosure, and Mary Jo talked about that this morning. We're asking them to, as Michelle said, make almost a public commitment in your nominating and governance charter that you're committed to diversity and that you will, as that commitment, include women and minorities in your candidate pool, which we call the Rooney Rule. And what we're finding, and every year the ask gets a little bit stronger in terms of, like Michelle said, what's your plan? But when you start asking companies that, then they start doing it, if they have to make that public. And that's kind of an easy, less confrontational way than, you know, just demanding a diverse candidate. Rodrigo, you as the Chief Investment Officer of a very innovative treasurer have, I think, an interesting job. Could you talk a little bit about what you all are doing and some of the initiatives that you're working on?
Yes, of course. So before I do, though, let me give you 2 comments. So there was a recent survey done by PwC of 900 corporate directors. Anonymous, of course, confidential, and they asked a variety of different questions about their views on diversity. And 2 points stood out to me. 16% of those directors, so approximately 150 or so, said diversity brings 0 value to the conversation. That's 150 directors already off the bat says brings no value. So you already know that there's a tough slog. Number 2, 11% said, I can't comment on it because we have no diversity. So right away, we know that 27%, we're already facing an uphill battle. And these are your fellow directors. These are folks that are out there. We don't know who they are and which companies they're at, but they have those strong views. And so that is a tough battle already. And number 2, the second comment is this new report that Spencer Stewart released that talks about half being women and diverse and only upticking to 22%. The key is by the time we reach parity, we're going to be 2050. 2050. And so it is a long ways away. It's actually more like 2040 something, but to drive the point home at that slow speed, it is going to take a couple decades. Now, I think some of the Travis and Michelle and Michael have all spoken very eloquently to some of the direct engagements and some of the shareholder resolutions, proxy voting. So I'm going to give you a different flavor and a different side that we also do, and that is our engagements with private equity and venture capital. Not only because the number of publicly listed companies has decreased, say, compared to 15 years ago. Some of that could be regulatory. Some of that could be the advent of money in the private markets. But I could tell you, when we're investing in venture capital and we're seeing the valuations of those companies increase exponentially over the last 5 to 10 years, as well as the advent of private equity and the valuations there as well. We're also asking when we're out there investing with various private equity firms and venture capital firms, not only who is on the portfolio companies, who's running them, who's on the boards there, because we often see that those boards are usually the ones that when they get spun off into an IPO, or when they get purchased as a separate subsidiary of some larger company, that they tend to be typically 70 to 80% of the same directors. And so, yes, we want to know that, but we also want to know who are the general partners, who are the GPs that we're working with in those particular private equity firms, because I could tell you that they tend to also, just as was alluded to before, is part of those networks, so they tend to put folks that they know on those networks as well. And so we also want to see diversity at those firms, and something that the comptroller very much said, it's those asset management firms. What are they doing? What do they look like? And what is important to them? And so I could tell you that it's something that we ask. It's something that we have began to pound on the sand, and it's something that we have also began working recently with a 30% coalition on reaching out to private equity firms and venture capital, because it is the new wave of valuations and wealth that is coming into this country in Silicon Valley, Chicago, New York City, and Boston, and even down in Denver and Austin. And so we also want to make sure that we're not just looking at publicly listed corporations, but also at the private markets as well.
Yeah, thank you for that. Just an aside, within our investor base, we have probably 12 LPs, major pension funds that invest substantially in private equity, and we think it's important, and we're in the early stages, but launch the same campaign that we're doing with public companies. So thank you, Rodrigo, for bringing that up. Can you talk just briefly about any other initiatives that you all are doing in Illinois with the treasurer?
Yes. So I've alluded somewhat earlier. So one of the big ones that we have is our Midwest Diversity Coalition, and we're starting out low-hanging fruit here. We are targeting small and medium companies that are headquartered all over the Midwest and have no women and no minorities. And so we're not even going after and saying, no, 2 or 3. We're just talking about 0 minorities or 0 women. And you would not believe the amount of pushback that we have received. But that is why we, as the sources of capital and the owners of these shares then can begin to engage directly with the nominating committee. And so as a result of reaching out, because we didn't want to just file right away, we reached out to them. We asked them for what was the diversity, what was the makeup of their boards, because we also want to make sure, what if we're getting the wrong information? So we reached out and said, can you provide us who's on your board, the gender of your board members, the race and ethnicity of your board members, how many folks are on your board, and do you intend to have, by the end of, at this point it was December 31, 2017. And then we also asked, do you have any mentions of diversity in your board recruitment strategy? And do you also ensure that there's at least one candidate in your recruitment pool? And then lastly, we said, do you have any other plans or anything else that we should be aware of? And so as part of this data collection piece, we started seeing companies reaching out proactively, those that did not have to be dragged, but those that wanted to be very proactive. We saw right away, we admit we have no diversity, but we want to work with you. Since you have brought it up, we have taken an inward look. And so as a result of that, they have gone out, either work with consultants or work with their board recruitment firm, often more times than not is Spencer Stewart, or done work with their general counsel or compliance officer, depending on the size of the company. And many of them, we're talking about dozens, have come out and have have changed their policies. And B, even more so, and more importantly, have appointed diverse candidates onto their boards. And so we decided that we wanted to target the Midwest first, especially in some of these rural areas that some of the smaller companies are headquartered. It is just, you wouldn't believe some of the pushback we've received, but as a result of the shareholder engagement, and once we reach out to those nominating committees, because usually the pushback's from management, not necessarily from the board itself, and usually the reason why is because they want to have their own networks be the board members who govern that company and makes it easier for them, which for us tells us a big issue about the independence of those companies as well. And then the second thing that we've done is just direct shareholder resolutions with Fortune 500 companies, and often we just do it, we co-file, and we go and look for other institutional investors that are out there and filing on behalf of on some kind of issue related to board diversity, and then we just jump on board with them because we know that it's better to operate as a village. And lastly, I would say that the New York Comptroller's Office is definitely the golden standard, and something that I've challenged my team that said we need to make sure that we get to where the Comptroller's Office is in the next 5 years, and that was about a year ago. And I see they're continuing to move forward and making it very hard for us to even try to catch up.
You guys are quite busy in the opioid work as well, which may not be relevant here, but national leadership. So right back at you.
So I have a question for all of you, and whoever feels comfortable, jump in. What do we mean when we talk about diversity, and what do you mean when you're talking to your companies in your investable universe? Because up until now, the coalition has, while our vision is a corporate boardroom embracing race, ethnicity, and gender, we then switch to, we want you, to focus on the gender. And, by the way, a woman of color would be great also, which is, I don't like the message there.
diversity, but I think are very important as well, especially as the markets go forward and each company, be it in the United States or international, becomes more and more international. The revenue exposure across companies, whether it be in Asia or Japan to America, and likewise American companies to South America and Asia Pacific, is only going to increase. And with that said, I think it's very important to be able to identify at a specific company level to define diversity. It makes it a little more challenging to really define diversity, but I think that's the most appropriate case. And that's why you have those, it goes back to why it's so important to have those individual conversations with the companies as well.
Mike?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, certainly, if you look at our guidelines, we define diversity of thought. But, I want to be clear, our push, we're very explicit about gender and race and ethnicity. And I will say that, in part because it's easier to actually identify, because we don't even know the gender. We can guess with pretty good accuracy, and people track the gender diversity in a boardroom, looking at names. Race and ethnicity is much, much, much more difficult. Which is in part why we're asking for the disclosure. We're very active in groups that are, prioritize gender diversity, but I do think that gender diversity seems to have garnered more of the focus and attention. It may be that because women are a majority of the population, and so that's a particular frustration. But we're very careful, and I think you heard it from the controller. From our perspective, it's explicit. Gender and its race and ethnicity, and that is what we're being asked to really engage companies on. I want to make a few points, and a lot of this was implicit in the comments a number of us made, but I want to make it explicit. Finding a director is difficult, but if you prioritize it, there's a sense of urgency, and I would commend BlackRock. BlackRock was a company that received a 30% coalition letter several years ago. BlackRock added 4 women in 2 years to its board. Is that correct? And I'm sure the high caliber, very high caliber directors. Now, it may be in some ways easier for BlackRock because there's some prestige that some other companies don't have. But I think that if you place some urgency and priority on it, the talent's out there, people can find directors. And the other thing I wanted to mention, how many directors in the room? Raise your hand if you're on a board. And if you're on a board and if you have age and or term limits, raise your hand. So from our perspective, if you have them, that's fine, but those are blunt instruments, and we'd much rather see the board have a conversation every year, look around the boardroom and decide, is this the right board for our current business strategy, the evolving risks of the business, who's adding value and who's not, and not rely on just waiting until someone hits their age limit or term limit, which may end up moving the wrong person off the board. And finally, on this point, this PwC study and data, keeps coming up in various ways, and I think that may have been the source where Michelle mentioned that 87% of directors look around the boardroom and talk to each other about finding directors. The other stat in there is something, and I don't remember exactly, I think it was 57% of respondents said that they believe there was someone, they sat on a board with someone who shouldn't be on that board.
It's gone up steadily every year since they've been doing this survey.
So it's up to you, and we're a long-term owner. 80% of our domestic portfolio is passive. We're going to own your companies in perpetuity. We're totally reliant on the directors we elect to constitute a board that will oversee strategy and risk and protect and create value on our behalf. So we put directors on a pedestal, but we also hold you accountable and have very high expectations for what we expect of you.
And Jared is our alternative investment person.
Yeah, I'll give you my own perspective. Diversity can be defined very broadly, and I think that Travis, put a finger on it, saying that it's best to look at it on a company-by-company basis, based on what the individual needs of a corporation. Patricia Panetta and I were interviewed in the KPMG board composition report that I think is on some of the tables. And my own personal view is that a real thoughtful nominating committee should look at board composition the same way that GM of a sports team looking to build a championship caliber franchise, looks at recruiting. So take a look at where the board has strengths, take a look at what the company's strategic goals and where the needs are, take a look at where the weaknesses are, and try to fill them. And then also try to fill them in a way that puts together a true team, right? Because we know that diverse sports teams perform better. You can't have all quarterbacks and expect to have a winning football team. As the comptroller said, diverse cities perform better. So put together a diverse group of people with different viewpoints, experiences, perspectives, so that you can truthfully in the boardroom have the type of discussions that Michelle referred to, of people coming together with different viewpoints, not assuming that everyone is thinking the same thing, therefore talking through their assumptions, and that type of cognitive dialogue, will ultimately lead to, in my view, better decision making. So when we look at our own recruiting at Barrington, we recognize the fact that, as has been said several times today, that people do naturally go to their own networks. And the PwC survey did point out that 87% of directors tend to go to their own networks, and 52% of boards also go to the CEO's network to tap to directors. And so to make sure that we were looking outside of our own networks, we have made affiliations with a number of organizations seeking to improve board diversity, one being the Latino Corporate Directors Association, but as well as Ascend Pinnacle and WCD and Women in the Boardroom. And through those sources, we're finding excellent candidates. And we are just at the beginning of these relationships, but we look forward to continuing to work with them to source candidates. As a general matter, we often find ourselves partnering with companies. As I said, we have a very collaborative approach. We're happy to partner with a company and come up with mutually acceptable directors that work well for the company and work well for us as outsiders. Our view is, if you have an underperforming company, and I'll end on this, if you have an underperforming company and underperforming board where it looks like it's very homogenous, if you can add an intelligent outsider with appropriate experience to that group, they're going to make the right decisions. We don't need to have any relationship with them at all. 9 times out of 10, I would say, they're probably going to make the same decision as we would. And then that 1 time out of 10, well, they're probably going to make the right decision because they have, this is the industry they know, and we'd probably be wrong. So that's our viewpoint and approach on that subject.
Thank you.
So we define diversity as different to the dominant culture. And when we have a truly diverse board, there is no dominant culture. That is what we're getting to. We're a long way from there. I'm not a Pollyanna person. I'm actually an Eeyore person. I think we have a long way to go. But that is the way we define it. And I used to work in Europe, and there was a joke in my team at the time that diversity on a German board was a white man who wasn't an engineer. So it will depend on where you are, on how you define it. We're very unrealistic if we think we're ever going to get close to 20% women on boards in Japan, certainly in my lifetime, because they're just not in the workforce. But I think one of the reasons that gender diversity has to be prioritized in the US is there's no credible threat of a quota, and if you look at what's happened in the markets in Europe where there is a quota, the women are found. And the quality varies, but the quality varies amongst white male directors, just to be clear. And the thing that I think is kind of gobsmacking is Italy, which has a really low rate of women in senior corporate roles, or in the workforce basically, in professional roles, has more women on boards than the US. That's insane. The US has had more women graduating business school and other senior level education facilities than men for many, many years now. So there's just the lack of progress is our own doing, and I think we need to fix it. The other thing I will say about diversity or a more diverse board is it makes the job of being chairman of the board much harder. And I think we need to think about whether chairmen of diverse boards need extra training, because people aren't going to be the same. It is going to take longer to get to the decision point and so on. And that is a good thing, but it means boards may need to be chaired and board meetings may need to be structured differently than they are today. And I don't actually speak for BlackRock as a corporate, but I do want to make one point. BlackRock did get the 30% coalition letter one day before they announced 2 women on their board. And so you shouldn't always mix correlation and causation. Just saying.
I was just going to mention one last point, and that is the rise of the millennials. You know, the millennial generation, those born between 1980 and the present, myself included, have very much different values than other generations. And I say this because a recent Deloitte study also said 90% don't care about a company's profits or how much a particular product necessarily costs. They care about the values that a company is incorporating. In terms of climate change, in terms of diversity in their employee workforce, in terms of sustainability of their practices, in terms of their impact on society, in terms of corporate social responsibility. And so if you
action, what the groups can do to raise the level of board diversity. So I want to throw that question onto you, knowing what you know about boards, engagement, everything you've seen. If you were sitting in those chairs of these groups saying collectively we can work together to make a difference, what's the one thing or two things that you think that these groups can do to really enhance the level of board diversity overall?
Let me, if I can just respond to that first, if I may. That's the spirit of the coalition.
Yeah.
We're 100 organizations, and one of those organizations this morning belonged to the coalition. The others don't, but I think that, and I'm not trying to sell the coalition necessarily, but I think, you know, it's the whole concept of the investors. The more that can come together and approach a company, the stronger they are, certainly the smaller firms. So I think that, you know, our organization, Esther now has joined our board. I mean, we really are trying to find a way to, you know, to work together to meet the mission of LCDA. We also working with ASCEND to try to do the same thing. So I think that that's the secret. I mean, the power is in the numbers. And I'll turn it over to the investors.
And I would, similar answer, but slightly some different or additional rationale, and whether it's 30% Coalition or the Alliance for Board Diversity. When we talk to a board about adding diverse candidates, and this comes back to the question about definition of diversity, we're not going to say you need a Latino director or you need an African American director. We're going to push them on diversity. And so, you know, it's a lot easier for us if we're going to say, gee, you know, you need to go outside the traditional recruiting circles and not just rely on people in your boardroom or even your consultant. And there's some groups out there, but it's awkward for us to say, go talk to LCDA or this group, but if there's a coordination, and then the other piece is where you have a constituency, and this, you know, LCDAs are not unique in this sense, but it's sort of automatic. But other groups have very high quality constituencies who may not yet be on boards. A process to sort of better identify or help board-ready candidates who aren't there yet, in a way of cataloging them in a way that a board isn't looking for an African-American candidate. They're looking for someone with global expertise who, marketing and X, Y, and Z, and there's a priority on finding diverse candidates. So if you have someone who fits that bill, so cataloging those skills and experience, and you know, the 3D database that CalPERS and CalSTRS helped launch, and is now domiciled at Equilar is a good place, you know, also to go.
Do you want, I just add one thing? You know, in cohorts like this where you have sitting experienced directors and newer directors and aspiring directors, peer learning is incredibly valuable. And also for the aspiring directors, experienced directors, helping them present themselves as a director, because most of them are still presenting themselves as executives. And you've got to be able to demonstrate that you can transition the skills you developed as an executive into the board context and be a contributing director in a boardroom. And that is a different skill set. And if you're presenting yourself as a doer, as an executive, it isn't always obvious for someone to see how that translates.
Yes.
We got some smart people at this table, so all three of us ask questions. But I'm an advocate, and so I hope you take it in that fashion. All of you have said how you don't say get an African American director, get a Latino director, or get a woman director, and you just say get diversity. I'm a part of the civil rights movement. What do you want me to do? Thank you so much. I'm part of the civil rights movement. I'm a kid of the 70s, and part of my problem is that you keep saying that, but what happens is they never find us, a Latino director. And if you don't educate the population with regard to the fact that we're 2.1 trillion to 3 trillion in economic strength, if you don't continue to say, hey, every time a white woman gets on, it's an African American male, not an African American female, or if you don't continue to say that Latino women never get on, and they happen to be the most affluent business people in my community. Women, not men, even though I'm a man. Like you guess you can tell, right? I don't see us making the progress that I need to make in terms of the future of this country, where we're now 18%, where we are becoming the babies, because nobody else is having babies but us, and nobody else bringing in immigration but us, so that if you don't understand the economic trends of what's happening in this country, your companies are not prepared for the future and for the opportunities to be able to continue to take care of the shareholders, which is really the most important concept. And so, having been involved in this for 30 years, if not longer, I was involved when we started getting African Americans on. Leon Sullivan, when he got to General Motors and so forth. It has continued to be an apartheid activity as it relates to Latinos on corporate boards. And what may happen is what the Cubans did in Miami. Hey, we take care of our own businesses. We'll run our own businesses. Heck with the whole area. We, like the elephant, all the communities move back to Miami. And so I think that there is an important element that you have as shareholders, as advocates, and as understanding what America is all about, where you bring the next generation up by its bootstraps, and the 97% white males who still run corporate America got to learn that they're a minority, and if they continue to run businesses that way, they're not going to work. I just need some feedback because I've heard it all day. Hey, I'm not going to recommend a Latino. I'm not going to recommend a woman. I'm not going to, hey, what the heck are we here for? If we're not going to recommend the brightest, most best looking, and the most intelligent community in the United States.
Do you want us to respond?
Of course.
I can respond by saying I haven't, at CalSTRS, all my colleagues at CalSTRS, we do commonly say, ask that specific question. Have you considered a woman? Have you considered an African American? Have you considered a Hispanic or Latino or Latina? These are questions that we do ask. So
You can't educate them on the economy and what's happening. Can't you educate them?
I do. I actually do bring up some of the GDP facts that you've just brought up as well, and also the driving force of the demographic trends here in America and how prominent of a problem it's going to be in America if those changes do not occur. So I'm there with you. I want to provide. I wish I could have the actions provide as evidence of the conversations that are occurring, and I'm hopeful that one day we'll get to that point. But as of right now, all I can do is tell you that yes, no, we do bring those up.
And that's part of our ask. We're asking them to have their boardroom reflect the U.S. workforce. And, you know, it's happening. Is it happening fast enough? Of course it's not. And, you know, we, meaning the coalition, I'm speaking for myself, and our members are constantly seeking ways to do it. And we have the investors, but we also have some other groups within the coalition. We have 40 champions of change. We had 2 here today. I don't know if Ada Alvarez is here. Raj Gupta is another one. You know, we need to mobilize them for us, and I spoke with them both earlier. So we're on it.
Let me comment on that. So
Yeah.
obviously, I'm a Latino. My parents came here from the 70s. My dad came several times. He got deported on a couple occasions. And, you know, you have to step into the breach. And, you know, I was in Iraq and Afghanistan, and so I know exactly what I'm going to get into when I'm going into some of these fights with some of these companies. And I am not afraid. I can't speak for my for my fellow panelists, but I am not afraid to call out a specific company. But I can tell you, it is increasingly, the companies that want to, it's easy. They want to talk to us. How can we help you? Let's get together. Who do you recommend? I throw out every organization that I can think of. Let them pick who they think is good. But I can tell you, the ones that don't want to, it is hard. And especially with some of the regulatory changes that are being proposed by the SEC and the new rule that they just released earlier this week, it is becoming increasingly hard though. And so our ability to go ahead and affect change is trying to be curtailed. And what we're trying to do is instead try to expand the pie, work with other institutional investors, work with the passive investors like BlackRock and Vanguard to make sure that there's other means to do this. Obviously, communicating through advocacy role, the media is very important here, through the bully pulpit, whether it's elected, appointed, or otherwise, community leaders, working with Reverend Jackson, working with Dolores Huerta down in Arizona. It doesn't matter. We will take whatever it takes to try to shame a company if we need to. But it's hard. We're not in those board seats trying to make those decisions. And so it is sometimes frustrating just because you may not see it necessarily every day, doesn't mean it's not necessarily happening behind the doors, because we also know that we're professionals and we want to work with companies first and foremost before we try to make some of those engagements. And as a separate note, what I would say is, in the world of private equity and venture capital, I tell you, the number of Latinos, and specifically even worse, the number of Latinas, it is horrible. Latinas are actually known as unicorns because people talk about them, but they don't actually exist. And so when I go out there and I'm trying to get more Latino private equity and venture capital, I have already tasked. We are going ahead and grabbing general partners or principals at firms and giving them $20, $30, $40 million and let them go start their own firms. Because if they're not coming to us and they're not there, we're going to go ahead and go outside the box and create some innovation. Either that, or we're going to give $30 million to this private equity firm and have them, as a condition of that, teach an up and coming Latino or woman or African American to go ahead and teach them. But right now, it's happening, but it's not happening fast enough, and that for me is a source of frustration as well.
But just in closing, because I'm getting a lot of people waving at me, but we have to be smart about it, because I can get angry too. And somebody told me, she's not here, Loretta, there she is. I had a anger management, but we have to be angry. But we have to be smart. And that's what the investors are doing, because they're touching the money. They're touching the stock price at the end of the day. And, that's the kind of thing that we have to do for all of us. Thank you.
Just one quick thing, and I think just as kind of more background and to get a sense of why you might hear some frustration. In fact, we had our tape last year. Our inaugural board leaders convening was hosted by Meg Whitman at Hewlett-Packard Enterprise. And Meg Whitman, we had a great fireside chat with her. And she told us that when they broke up HP into two companies, she had an opportunity to put two diverse boards together. Actually, we have this on tape, so I can talk about what she said. But she said that they hired a search firm, and they got great women candidates, got great African American candidates. They had Asian candidates already on some of those boards. She got no Latino candidates. This was just last year. This is still happening now. And so she challenged the search firm and said, hey, there's a list of the top women in business. Go get me the list of top Latinos. And she said, voila, there was a lot of great candidates. And, we have a woman on the HP Inc. board. So I think just for reflection and just for, we know you guys are advocating across the board, just know that sometimes, many times, that Latinos are often not even mentioned or in the mix. And certainly, for 50% of California, and of course New York and Illinois. So I think just for informational purposes, that's kind of a little bit of where a lot of our membership is coming from. And Fortune 1000 companies were about 2% of the Fortune 1,000 company seats, whereas we're 18% of the population. And of Latinas, it's 0.5%. So we did start a program, and we're very new, so we appreciate, one, we joined the coalition, and we look forward to working with all of you because you're doing a very important work. And we just wanted to, continue to kind of let you know a little bit of the experience that's still going on today, but that's also why we were formed. So thank you for being here.
Thank you.